The latitude, the third area I mentioned, is also a really big concern to pediatricians, psychologists, and educators, and so on. Because if you imagine, let's talk about latitude this way. Let's imagine two different opposite scenarios. In one scenario, the parents leave the child free to decide everything on his or her own. They just do what they want. So there's maximum freedom, but there's no protection from danger. Not good. At the other extreme, the parents make sure there's never any danger because the child never has to live with the consequences of anything and is always protected. So things are safer if you want, but there's no learning and there's no practice about resilience. And in between these two is a big wide middle, right in here. And kids who grow up here are the ones who end up having a chance to enhance and develop their resilience. Because in here, what happens is the kids have to live with some consequences. And many of us, certainly people who do what I do, I travel in schools all the time, and I run a children's mental health clinic, and we get to see lots of evidence of kids who are growing up over here, too far over here. So, for example, we have many schools across the country, even the best will tell you, teachers will tell you, we have many more situations than we used to where something happens and the child goes home and the parent calls up and says, I know he couldn't have done that because he told me so. Yes, I know he's only 7, but he doesn't lie. He's the only 7-year-old in the world who doesn't lie and who always sees the complete truth. I bet a lot of you here, even those of you who are much younger than I bet you can remember that if you got in trouble at school, you got in trouble at home. Even if, like me, you were often right and the school was often wrong. I went to a very good Quaker school in Philadelphia, but they were not always right. And my parents never assumed that they were wrong. Right? You need to trust me. There is no school of any kind left in America, none, that can routinely count on that. It still happens, just not enough for the school to automatically count on. We have many more parents who will say to the school things like, we certainly support your policy, your discipline policy, but we need an exception for our daughter. We don't want you to change the policy, it's quite a good policy, but we don't want you to apply it to her. You apply it to other people's children, it could have a powerful deterrent effect, but we don't want that on her record. And we have lots more situations where parents will go to bat even when the student has done something that's clearly wrong in an effort to make sure that the resume doesn't have a smirch on it. And when you're uncertain and worried about the future, it's harder to tolerate the fact that your child might have to live with the consequences of and learn from something really, that was very difficult at the time. We even, I have to say this, we have small but growing groups of people around the country who say to their local independent school and stuff, things like, and even to their public, we're not paying all this money for her to get a C. Now, I'm sure none of you would do this, but you may know some people who do. Do they dare do that here at Randolph? They don't. Never, I'm sure not. Well, I'll tell you what I always say to the teachers is that if they ever, next time they hear this, what they should do is a look of frank puzzlement should come across their face and reach for the pen and say, I'm going to speak to the business office. Perhaps we're only charging you the C tuition. Now, I'm making a joke. But I want to be serious about it for a second. It's easy to do what I just did, which is to make fun. And first of all, it's a very tiny group of people. But I don't find it so hard to understand. And here's why. So I'm surely older than anybody in this room. When I got out of the independent school where I went, I got into Princeton early decision, which sounds really good, and it was good. But I got in with a record back then that would be unlikely to get me in there today. I had a good record, it wasn't bad, and I went to a really good school, that was the difference. But when I went, the Ivy League was taking almost 2 out of every 3 applicants. The reason? They only looked at kids from a very small universe of elite secondary schools. That's all they looked at. And So the good news was that anxiety was low. The bad news was that access was very restricted and unfair. But even if I hadn't gone to college way back then, I would have had no trouble when I was growing up finding a blue-collar job that had lifetime employment, basically, and a steadily rising wage. And that's shifted around too. Today, the difference is the elite colleges are taking 1 out of 30, 1 out of 35. Harvard is about to begin, and they'll have a class of a couple thousand, 2,000 plus, and they've already turned down this year something like 5,000 valedictorians. The good news, access is much fairer. The bad news, anxiety is much higher. But even if I wasn't interested in doing that, but I could go to a really good school like this one, or other schools in the area. I could go to a university and maybe a couple of years of grad school, and I could land a good job, and it could get vaporized overnight. And that's true not just these last couple of difficult years. That was true 10 years ago. What has gone up for many people is opportunity. What's gone down, as I said earlier, is predictability. And it makes it harder to have the confidence that I can let my child learn. And it makes it harder to face the reality that there's a number of things we really can't do very much about for our kids. So if you choose to send your child here to Randolph, you'll be helping to shape in some way the other kids he's likely or she's likely to come in contact with and therefore make friends with. But you can't make your child like this kid as opposed to that kid. And you can't make your child have high self-esteem. You can't do it. It's not possible. You can try to do things that will sort of produce something like that. But one of the things we used to have an easier time facing, and we thought about children growing up, was the sort of limits to what we can do. And when you think hard enough about resilience, one of the places it ends up taking, at least me, is to realize that there are a number of things that, and I've just talked about a couple, that can be helpful. But that's different from saying that we can guarantee it for everybody.